Okay, here he is, Glenn Kimball, a BA in journalism, MA in communications. In addition, of course, he has successfully completed all work for a PhD in communications and passed his doctoral exams. He's the former president of the International Exchange School, vice president of 2 cell phone companies. Hey, I might ask Glenn about the cell phone stories. And he's taught school at Southern Illinois University and is ranked by student evaluations in the top 10 instructors at the university. Here he is. Hey, Glenn, how are you?
It's good to hear from you again, George.
You too. Hey, but I might as well ask you, if you're the president of 2 cell phone companies, what's your reaction to that story from that neurosurgeon?
Well, we were concerned back at the time. You know, I had a Motorola, too, just like you did. And we were concerned about the effects. We had some people that were using our cell phones who were experiencing some physical difficulties, and I stopped using them. I have one today, but I use it maybe 3 minutes a day for emergencies, you know.
Well, okay. Well,
obviously, dealing with you, we deal with Twisted Pair over the hard lines, and I like it so much better. It's a lot clearer, and it doesn't experience all the problems that they have with cell phones. But we live in an environment where we're getting bombarded by all kinds of electromagnetic radiation, and we don't know the effects because cell phones have not been around very long.
Okay, Glenn, this story, and I had to bring you in on it, about the possibility that an asteroid destroyed the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's go back. First of all, Sumerian tablets, that I find fascinating. How about you?
Well, obviously Sumerian tablets are a very important part of our history. The particular one in question here was they found about 150 years ago. Not that they found it in the dirt. They found it in a collection they already possessed. But it talks about a meteor event that happened January 29th, the year 3123 BC, which is nowhere close to the events that happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. We're talking about between 1,200 and 1,500 years difference, depending upon whether David Rohl is right in his book, Test of Time, an absolutely brilliant text written in Great Britain. We're probably talking about the events at Sodom and Gomorrah. Could have been a meteor, but there are some problems with that as well. Vindel Jones obviously has been on the ground in that region of the country for a lot longer than anybody else that I know of. In visiting the proposed sites, they don't know the exact site of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's gone. There are no ruins, there's no foundations, etc. They can only guess where it was at. But in this particular region, we're talking about a mile square, roughly. There are no plants growing. And you cannot take the soil from the ground in this particular area, fertilize it, put seeds in the ground, and have it grow anything, because it will not grow.
Okay, what do you think the Sumerian astronomers report, I guess, of a white stone bowl approaching? You know, it could have been a flying saucer.
Yeah, I think they may have been right. There may have very well have been a meteor that struck the ground or didn't strike the ground near the Sea of Galilee or the Dead Sea. It really struck in the Alps, and the backlash burnt some of the territory. By backlash, we mean when a meteor travels within the atmosphere, especially one this large, it will it'll break apart as it travels through the atmosphere and send incendiary pieces around and start fires for thousands of miles. That very well could have happened at that particular moment in history, but it had nothing to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah was really a strange event, to say the least.
So do you believe in the biblical account of what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? What do you think happened, Glenn?
Well, part of it has to be metaphoric in nature, and I don't doubt that at all. I lean toward listening to what people say a lot more than listening to archaeologists. When an archaeologist enters a particular archaeological site, the first thing they do is they gravitate to the kind of pots that are on the ground. You can't tell history through the shape of a pot. You might be able to date it, but that tends to be what historians and archaeologists do. Is they have their own little flavor of the way they tend to describe events in a particular area. I'd rather listen to what the people say, even if it is metaphorical in nature. Their language tends to involve us more and tell us more about what's happening than the archaeology itself. And so when we hear the biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah, these kind of events have occurred worldwide that are anomalies, destructions. They're extinction-level events that have occurred throughout history, all the way back to the time of Mu and before, where entire populations of people were destroyed, not necessarily by comets or meteors, but by events that no one can explain,
Well, let me go on with this story here, Glenn, about this study here. It says, using computers to recreate the night sky. Thousands of years ago, scientists have pinpointed the sighting to shortly before the dawn of June 29th in the year 3123. That's pretty darn accurate. But you say Sodom and Gomorrah happened later on.
At least 1,200 years later, probably around the year 1500, roughly BC, depending upon whether David Roll is right or not. And I think that he's closer to the account. We know that to give your audience some sort of idea of the time period here, we look at Abraham, who was at the time of Lot, who was at the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? He had Abraham bore Isaac, Isaac bore Jacob, Jacob bore Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, and then Moses then was the great-great-grandson of Levi, who was the brother of Joseph. And that was at the time of Amarna, or the end of the 18th dynasty in Egypt. That was 1300 roughly BC. So we couldn't possibly be talking about 3123 BC. It's just not possible.
You know what I find fascinating, Glenn, and maybe the account is not accurate here from these researchers, but the fact that old historians, old texts talk about calamities and events. That I find fascinating.
Well, they do, and we've done a couple of classes in our college dealing with these kinds of things. In fact, we're right in the middle of the second and third classes on the civilization called Mu, or the one that the Romans renamed Lemuria after lemurs. But that civilization was destroyed based on a fire and water scenario, where fire was seen in the sky and then the water rose. And some say that the continent sunk, but it's very possible that the fire in the sky caused the poles to melt and sunk these things into the ocean, and then with the weight of the water itself, it actually caused the tectonic plates to sink farther into the Pacific Ocean. And so, we're talking about an entire history of people who were well advanced in their society. We take, for example, on the Easter Island, that very, very few people understand the history of Easter Island. Easter Island is 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. It couldn't possibly have supported a society large enough to have put the moai into place, these stones that are facing the ocean for protection. It's not possible, and it's not possible that big of an island would have grown trees enough to roll these things on. Some of these things are 70 feet high. 70 feet high means that stone weighed 90 tons at least, which is thousands and thousands. That's 180,000 pounds. You put 180,000 pounds on top of a Gamorrah tree or a palm tree, and it crushes it flatter than a pancake. They didn't roll these things into place. These people had on this island a network of towers, a system of housing which would only house people that were 3 feet high. These towers were used as some suggest are placed in such a way to take advantage of earthquakes, etc., and release the energy from the earth, and could have very well have been their way of addressing the problems of earthquakes in the Pacific Ocean, which were extinction-level events. The kind of tsunamis that would drown an island 13 miles long and 7 miles wide would happen every 1,000 years, And these people were on this island for 10,000 years. So we're talking about them having some sort of protection system in place that prevented them from being exterminated. And they also are rumored to have had a system where they could control the weather patterns.
So they had high technology then?
Absolutely. And, our historians look back in time, and they do a very simple linear analysis. They say everything before our day headed back in time is more primitive than us. The reality of the matter is that's not true. You look back in time, we can find pockets in the Kramos sense of the word where they had higher civilizations than we do today.
All right, Glenn, stay with us. We're going to come right back. I want to talk a little bit more about the account of turning people into pillars of salt. Glenn will stay with us next hour for your phone calls as well. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Hey, if you subscribe to the After Dark newsletter, or if you're coming up for renewal, we're going to give you a free CD. You just pay a nominal shipping and handling fee. It's called J.C. Webster Rants. You know, J.C.'s been calling into the program for years, screaming, yelling about everything, about his compound, about his ex-girlfriend Edna, and everything else. Well, we're going to give you a whole compilation of those phone calls when you subscribe to After Dark or renew. You can do that by calling 1-888-727-5505 or go online at coasttocoastam.com. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. We're into our floating format tonight. Glenn Kimball with us for 2 hours, and then Dr. Richard Boylan joins us for the final 2 hours of the program. Glenn, your description of a pillar of salt.
Right. Well, on the banks of the Dead Sea, they have pillars of salt, literally pillars of salt. And so this is not an uncommon thing for the region. There are salt accumulations that mimic all kinds of shapes all the way around the Dead Sea. So turning someone into a pillar of salt may have been a metaphor here. Turning Lot's wife, who, by the way, was a citizen of Sodom and Gomorrah before he married her, turning her into a pillar of salt may have been a metaphorical exchange for her being destroyed in some fashion, and the only thing that was left was a pillar of salt in her wake. We don't know. We weren't there. But certainly something happened that's very strange, and something very strange happened in that similar location on a couple of occasions. We know the walls of Jericho, for example, came tumbling down after the priests surrounded the city and blew their horns 7 times and were able to destroy the walls of Jericho. And so we're not talking just about lumping every single disaster in the Judea area or in Palestinian area by explaining it away by the landing of a meteor. That's kind of like Eric von Däniken lumping everything that happened in the pre-Inca era to the landing of alien spacecraft. There may have been some aliens involved, but certainly there was a great deal more going on than just merely lumping all of history and blaming the aliens for it.
And what if it was strictly biblical, Glenn? What if the biblical account that something from above, some divine intervention, destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed the walls of Jericho?
Well, we know that Moses, when he was on the banks of the Red Sea, called down the pillars of fire from heaven that stood in the way between the Egyptian army and the Israel trying to cross the Red Sea. If that kind of an event, if pillars of fire could be blocking the way of the Egyptian army, burning Sodom and Gomorrah to the ground wouldn't have been any big deal. We know one thing. Let's back up in the story for just a moment.
Okay.
We back up to the time of Abraham. Abraham and Lot now were family. Okay. Abraham paid his tithing to a man called Melchizedek. In fact, Jesus was referred to as being a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. That's the only reference that Jesus is associated with in the Bible, in the entirety of the Bible. This Melchizedek character is very, very interesting because he was the king of Salem, or the city that was previous to Jerusalem. So Melchizedek was promised in the Bible that he would have power over death because of his character. We call it righteousness, but that's a Christian term. His character obviously proved out, and he was able to achieve power over his own life. And he did not die in a conventional sense of the word. As a matter of fact, there have been consortiums of scholars, and by the turn of the century, the early 1800s, there was a Catholic group who were researching the possible involvements of Melchizedek through history over a long period of time. As a matter of fact, in the Royal British Museum, if you look up on the wall, there's what they call the window of Melchizedek. It's a stained glass window. And who is he ordaining king? He's ordaining King Arthur to be king. Now, how in the world did that happen?
That's a great story.
Yeah, and that's in our class called the Great Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek is this guy to whom Abraham paid tithing, but then he disappears at the very end of Abraham's life. But then when Lot sees these two angels coming to him to warn him of the destruction, he recognizes them. He knows who they are. He calls them angels, but they are physical human beings because the people of Sodom and Gomorrah want them to come out and to molest them in some fashion. That's when he offered his own daughters in lieu of taking the holy man hostage and molesting them.
Glenn, Michael Cremo, in his work Forbidden Archaeology, believes that there were ancient nuclear wars. Is it possible that that's what we could be talking about here?
I think Michael is probably onto something there, but not nuclear wars as we would see them in terms of dropping the bombs from B-52s. We would be talking about the power of these great priests or magicians or sorcerers or whatever you want to call them, having the power to turn and cleanse people off the face of the earth. That's more likely the case in this scenario. Lot was told that none of his people were to turn around and look at this event, though they did turn around after they were given one night to leave town, basically. If you remember, the angels, Lot prayed and said, if I can find 50 righteous people, will you destroy the city for 50?
Right.
And it got down to 2, or it got down to 10 and 2, and they couldn't find anybody. Well, in essence, the angels gave them one night to get out of town. And they couldn't have possibly have gotten far enough away in the middle of the night to have prevented themselves from being affected by a meteor hitting the ground. And that doesn't mean turning around and looking at it and being affected by the flash blast that would have happened in a nuclear weapon. This was some sort of targeted event where the wife of Lot couldn't resist trying to find out what had happened to the place where she grew up. She obviously looked back and saw this thing and was either incinerated into ash by some sort of event like a nuclear event, or she was in reality, if we take it literally, she was turned into a pillar of salt. That seems less likely to me than having been exposed. She couldn't resist peeking up over the horizon and seeing what was happening. But later in the day, they looked back and they saw the smoke of the city rising, and they knew it had been destroyed.
What if some explosion, nuclear or otherwise, you know how they wear these special goggles and glasses in the old testing days? What if she turned around and went blind?
Well, she died over the whole thing. It killed her.
All right. So you believe that portion then, that she died. Okay. She
died. She is no longer in the text. She doesn't survive the history. At that point, she's missing. But once again, one of the things that's interesting here is that these men, who they call them angels that were visiting Lot, could visit. Let's presume for a moment that it was Melchizedek, because Lot recognized them.
Okay.
If that's the case, then these men came and went without the use of a spacecraft. They appeared on the scene and they disappeared off the scene without some sort of visible technological help.
All right, time travelers, maybe.
Well, or dimensional travel.
Or dimensional travelers. I'll agree with that.
And in our class we talked about the Watchers. You and I had this discussion well over a year ago about who the Watchers were.
Right.
They could come into this world and leave this world without the benefit of a spacecraft or without visible technology. And as a matter of fact, how many stories we had this conversation too, where how many people do you know have been in distress somewhere in the world, had a flat tire in the middle of nowhere, some guy comes walks up to the car, helps them fix the car, and they turn around, the guy's gone.
Yeah.
And I met one of those guys, and we had that story on Coast some time ago where a guy walked through a locked door, and gave me a piece of information that kept me motivated along my way. And when I turned around, he was gone. So I met one, and how many of us know something like that as someone who has had an experience like that? These people come and go. And so this portal that people can use to travel through, which is, how many witnesses to this kind of event do we have? Millions of witnesses to this kind of event. Coming through that portal could also be a destructive finger.
I think so. Now, do you believe, Glenn, that with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, regardless of how it occurred, was also the basis of the fact that they were engaged in all this debauchery, and that was the reason for this?
Well, I do. Let me answer yes, and let's point to a historical text that might discuss this as well. Hesiod wrote it in the 8th century B.C. when he wrote his Theologica. He was the teacher of subsequent generations like Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. He said that the last days would be characterized by our skepticism, and that we would be destroyed because of our skepticism. And he didn't call it wickedness per se. He more referred to it as a lack of faith or a lack of acknowledgement. There's been a couple of television and movies out recently that talk about people going into the future and finding very advanced societies who are totally ignorant, people that couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag, but technology suffices to give them everything they want, but they become actually more ignorant because of their technology rather than being more brilliant because of their technology. In essence, that's exactly what's happening to us today, whether we like it or whether we don't, or whether we acknowledge it or whether we don't. Our societies, our test scores in America for our school kids have gone down, where our kids are not smarter than our grandparents. In terms of being bright, well-read, etc.
Well, like I've always said, Glenn, not all, but some, try going to a fast food place and have them give you change without the aid of their computer or electronic cash register.
Exactly.
They can't do it. That's
exactly right, and it's getting worse. And, and whether we like it or not, that same disease has infected our scholars. Scholars have dumbed up, too, or dumbed down, I should say. We don't do the level of investigation, the level of research that individuals would do, like at the time of Louis Pasteur. Sure, we have specialists, we have savantism in terms of technology, where people are finding discoveries that are absolutely amazing. But you talk to these people, and some of them you can't even hold a conversation with them. I don't know if you've done that in recent past, but I've been at a restaurant where somebody was embedded in some sort of highly technical engineering event, and it was very hard to hold a conversation with them.
Yeah, no, that's true. Okay, let's review a little bit about Sodom and Gomorrah. Something happened, destroyed the city, may have wiped out Lot's wife because of it. Maybe she was incinerated. Who knows? What do you, Glenn Kimball, think happened?
I think that these angels had the power to send a destructive force through the their dimensional ability and pinpoint the destruction of a city. I don't think it was a widespread event. I think it was extremely well targeted. Otherwise, we would see the evidence of that in the area of some sort of crater or some sort of massive event, and we don't see that. And we don't find it in archaeology, nor do we read about it in the text. We talk about the text, these Sumerian texts that talk about this meteor hitting the ground in 3123 B.C. We can see that in the Alps. You can go to the Alps and you can find the craters. You can find exactly where this thing hit. You don't see that in Jerusalem or in Judea. You don't see it along the shores of the Jordan River.
What if it blew up in the atmosphere like it apparently did in the early 1900s over Tunguska in Siberia?
Yeah, even in Tunguska, you can see the evidence of where it hit today. I know that it's only been 100 years since that event, or a little bit more than 100 years since that event. But you're going to be able to see that particular event for 1,000 years, and you don't see that here in this particular scenario. This was a very targeted, pinpointed event that happened and a city burnt to the ground. A city was maybe not burnt to the ground. It may have been
incinerated
instantly, and only a puff of ash was left.
Okay, so you believe it was done intentionally?
Well, it was. The angels certainly knew it was coming. They were warned to get out of town. The time was pinpointed and targeted, and it certainly didn't affect the populations that were there after the return of Moses from the Sinai. There was an entire population of Canaanites that extended well over that particular valley, over the entire plain there. So we're not talking about a widespread destruction. We're talking about a very targeted, localized event, regardless of what happened. History, we have texts from the region shortly before and shortly after that particular event, so it was not a widespread event. It was a very pinpointed event.
Glenn, exactly what is at Sodom and Gomorrah now?
Nothing.
Nothing. Jeez.
Very close to there is a place where they had built a temple where Moses, the foundations, you can still see the footings there, where a temple was built to make the 10th temple of Moses a permanent structure. But there's nothing there. I mean, there's no people living there. There's nothing that grows there. You don't go and water your sheep there. It's completely desolate.
Have they done radioactive tests out there?
They haven't done a lot of testing. Vendel Jones said that they had sent some of the ground to laboratories, and they still hadn't definitively come up with the cause of why plants wouldn't grow there. But if you had a meteor strike the ground here, like the one here near Phoenix,
well, you'd have a huge crater, first of all,
well,
right?
Yeah, but plants are growing there.
Right.
Plants are growing right down in the middle of the crater. They're growing all along the outside edge. We have meteors hit the atmosphere hundreds of times a day, and that doesn't cause the ground to go desolate. This was a totally unique event. To have this event happen and then not be able to grow anything for 3,500 years, that's got to be one powerful whoop-de-doo, okay?
It was poisoned for some reason.
Yeah, it was adios amigo forever,
Well, were they told this was going to be forever?
Yep.
That's
they were told
fascinating.
it was over with.
Is there any structures left or anything in that area? I guess not.
Nothing. There's no archaeology. To my knowledge, I don't know that any footings of any buildings, any remnants of any houses. There's nothing there.
What does it look like? Just dust and desert?
It looks like moonscape to me. I mean, and I didn't spend a lot of time out there. I wasn't too interested in staying around where Vendel Jones said nothing could grow. I'm having a hard time to stay alive myself. I don't need to have an artificial problem with something I don't understand. But
no.
It's completely, there's nothing there. Zero. Caputo. Don't build here because it's probably not a good idea.
Glenn, what else have you been working on?
Me, I've been working most recently on this event that you launched me on a long time ago, which was why John the Baptist, his inscriptions are all over the tunnels beneath Jerusalem, and not Jesus. Working on that particular story, and certainly we came up with two amazing texts. We came up with the descriptions preserved by the Templars, the wisdom and advice and counsel of John the Baptist. That survives in our day, by the way. It was hidden. It was Henry II tried to destroy it when he burnt the temple the church on top of Glastonbury on the hill there. He tried to burn it out, but the text, because it was a library, in addition to a holy site and a burial site, but the Glastonbury Abbey, the books from there left, and in those texts was a complete description of the teachings and wisdoms of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was suggested to be the second most important prophet behind Jesus in all biblical history, and yet we have almost none of his teachings, nothing that he taught. How is that possible? Yeah. And then the Mandaeans have an actual text called the Gospel of John the Baptist, which has been kept secret and hidden forever. I mean, only the Mandaeans have used this text. We've gotten a copy of that and do that in its entirety as well.
All right, well, stay with us. Glenn Kimball will take your phone calls. His websites are linked up right now at coasttocoastam.com. I'm George Norrie. We'll be right back.